You're pronouncing the prayer backward. The quiet voice drifted across the marble hall so gently that for a heartbeat, no one reacted, as though the words themselves had become trapped beneath the vaulted ceiling before finally reaching the rows of scholars gathered beneath the brilliant museum lights. Every conversation stopped. Every camera turned. The chief curator slowly lowered the linen cloth that had covered the weathered stone tablet resting inside a climate-controlled glass display. Reporters exchanged puzzled glances while television crews instinctively pointed their lenses toward the unexpected interruption. At the center of the room stood Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, America's most celebrated expert in forgotten languages, his silver-framed glasses catching the pale glow from the chandeliers above. He had spent nearly 30 years studying civilizations that had vanished long before the first European ships reached North America, and only moments earlier, he had confidently announced that no living person could accurately read the inscription carved across the newly uncovered artifact. The statement had been greeted with respectful applause, until a calm, teenage voice quietly challenged the conclusion. Heads turned toward the back entrance where a thin black boy stood just inside the open doorway. His oversized gray hoodie faded from years beneath the sun, a worn backpack hanging from one shoulder, a rolled sleeping bag tucked beneath his arm, as if he had wandered in simply to escape the November wind. Security guards immediately stepped toward him, already convinced he had entered the museum by mistake. The boy didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the ancient document with steady eyes that seemed strangely familiar with every weathered symbol carved into its surface. A faint smile flickered across Dr. Richard Collins's face before growing into open amusement. "Son," he called loudly enough for the audience to hear, "this is an academic presentation, not a public library." Soft laughter spread across the room. A few guests politely looked away. Others folded their arms, already expecting the interruption to end within seconds. Only Professor Emily Carter remained unusually still. She watched the boy instead of the guards approaching him. There was no panic in his expression, no embarrassment, only quiet certainty. Outside, cold rain tapped gently against the towering glass walls, while inside the climate-controlled gallery smelled faintly of polished oak, old paper, and limestone dust lifted from the excavation site only weeks before. The silence that followed felt heavier than the artifact itself. Dr. Whitmore narrowed his eyes. He had spent a lifetime recognizing confidence, arrogance, fear, and deception. What he saw in the boy's face resembled none of them. It looked almost like recognition. The nearest security officer reached for the teenager's shoulder, but before a hand could touch him, the boy spoke once more, still calm, still respectful. "The first line isn't a warning," he said. "It's an invitation." The room froze again. Several linguists instinctively looked back toward the inscription. A television producer quietly lowered her headset. Somewhere near the rear of the audience, a notebook slipped onto the marble floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the enormous hall. "Doctor," Whitmore slowly turned back toward the stone tablet, then toward the homeless boy standing beneath the museum's towering entrance, and for the first time since the discovery had been announced to the world, uncertainty crossed the face of the man everyone believed had all the answers. Elias Brooks looked at the guards before quietly raising both hands, not in surrender, but in simple respect. "I am not here to interrupt," he said softly. "I only wanted to keep the words from being misunderstood." One of the guards hesitated, glancing toward Dr. Jonathan Whitmore for direction. The renowned linguist remained silent. His attention never left the teenager's face. Around them, hundreds of guests waited without speaking. The soft hum of the museum's ventilation system suddenly seemed louder than the crowd itself. Professor Emily Carter slowly stepped away from the front row and approached the display. She studied the symbols carved into the weathered stone before looking back at Elias. "You said the first line is an invitation," she asked calmly. "Why?" Elias shifted his eyes toward the ancient document rather than toward the audience. "Because the third symbol is not a mountain," he answered. "It is an open doorway. Whoever translated it as a warning ignored the mark carved beneath it." Several researchers instinctively leaned closer to the enlarged photographs projected across the enormous screen behind the artifact. Fingers hurried across laptop keyboards. Someone zoomed into the image until every crack in the stone filled the display. The room remained perfectly still except for the faint clicking of computer keys. Dr. Richard Collins folded his arms with an impatient sigh. He memorized something from the internet, he muttered. Ancient civilizations are full of myths online. His comment drew a few quiet nods, but far fewer than before. Emily narrowed her eyes as she examined the enlarged inscription. She noticed a tiny carved line beneath the symbol exactly where Elias had described it. It was so faint that years of dust had almost erased it. She looked toward Dr. Whitmore. "The mark is there," she whispered. Whitmore stepped closer to the screen without answering. His polished shoes echoed softly against the marble floor. He adjusted his glasses and stared for several long seconds. The additional carving was unmistakable, tiny, nearly invisible, but real. He slowly reached for a leather notebook that had traveled with him to excavation sites across 4 continents. Flipping through yellowed pages filled with handwritten sketches, he compared the symbol with drawings made almost 20 years earlier during a dig in northern Turkey. His expression grew increasingly thoughtful. Behind him, reporters sensed something changing. Camera shutters began clicking again, this time more cautiously. Nobody laughed anymore. Elias remained near the entrance, exactly where he had first spoken. Rainwater still glistened on the shoulders of his faded hoodie. His backpack rested quietly against one leg, worn from countless miles of walking through city streets. He did not appear eager for attention. If anything, he seemed ready to leave. Emily noticed it first. "You were not planning to stay," she said. Elias offered a small smile. "I only wanted the document to be heard correctly." Whitmore slowly closed his notebook. His voice carried through the gallery with measured calm. "Young man," he said, "before anyone escorts you anywhere, I would like to ask you one question." Every eye returned to Elias. Whitmore drew a careful breath before speaking again. "Who taught you to recognize a language that every expert in this room believed had disappeared forever?" The question lingered in the air so completely that even the television cameras seemed reluctant to move. Elias lowered his eyes for only a moment before answering with the same quiet composure that had unsettled everyone since he entered the gallery. "My grandfather taught me," he said. "He said every language carries a heartbeat, and if you only memorize the words, you never hear what the people were trying to leave behind." Dr. Jonathan Whitmore studied the teenager carefully. There was no trace of rehearsed confidence in the answer. It sounded like a memory repeated 100 times, polished not by performance, but by affection. Dr. Richard Collins gave a dismissive shake of his head. "Convenient story," he muttered. "Anyone can claim an invisible teacher." Elias did not respond. Instead, his fingers lightly traced the frayed strap of his backpack, worn smooth by years of carrying everything he owned from one place to another. Professor Emily Carter noticed the movement. It reminded her of students clutching notebooks before difficult examinations, except this boy carried no textbooks, only a faded canvas bag patched together with careful stitches. Whitmore stepped closer. "What was your grandfather's name?" he asked. "Samuel Brooks," Elias replied. The name produced no immediate recognition among the scholars gathered around the display. Collins smirked, clearly expecting the conversation to end there. Whitmore remained thoughtful. He quietly repeated the name to himself as though searching through decades of conferences, publications, and forgotten correspondence. Nothing surfaced. Emily noticed something else instead. Elias never looked toward the audience, waiting to judge him. His attention remained fixed on the ancient inscription, almost as though he were greeting an old friend rather than examining an archaeological discovery. Outside, the rain continued to streak across the towering glass walls, while the late afternoon light softened into silver. Inside, the museum lights reflected across polished marble floors and the protective glass surrounding the artifact, creating faint reflections that shimmered beneath every movement. One reporter cautiously raised a hand. "Young man," she asked, "if your grandfather knew this language, why has no university ever heard of him?" Elias hesitated. His expression changed for the first time, not with fear, but with quiet sadness. "He tried," he answered. "He mailed letters. He sent translations. He kept hoping someone would read them." The room fell silent again. "Did they?" Emily asked gently. Elias slowly shook his head. Most of the envelopes came back unopened. The ones that did not come back never received an answer. Whitmore felt an unexpected weight settle in his chest. He had spent decades reviewing academic submissions, conference abstracts, and research proposals. Thousands of names had crossed his desk over the years. How many had disappeared without ever being noticed? Collins let out a restrained laugh. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Elias nodded respectfully. My grandfather used to say the same thing. He carefully removed his backpack and unzipped it. Several security officers instinctively stiffened, but Whitmore quietly raised one hand, signaling them to wait. Elias reached inside with slow, deliberate movements and pulled out an old cloth wrapped neatly around something rectangular. The faded fabric showed years of careful folding, its edges softened by time rather than neglect. He held it gently with both hands, almost reverently, before looking toward Whitmore. "This is why I came today," he said softly. "I thought someone here might finally recognize what he spent his whole life trying to preserve." The folded cloth rested in Elias Brooks's hands with a care usually reserved for something priceless. He stepped forward only after Dr. Jonathan Whitmore gave a slight nod, the distance between them shrinking until only the glass display separated the ancient artifact from the bundle the boy carried. Every camera lens followed the movement. Every reporter leaned in. Even Dr. Richard Collins stopped whispering. Elias slowly unfolded the faded fabric layer by layer until a weathered leather notebook appeared beneath it. Its dark brown cover had softened with age, the corners rounded from decades of careful use, while a single elastic band held yellowed pages tightly together. The faint scent of old paper drifted into the cool museum air as Elias gently removed the band and opened the notebook near the middle. Delicate sketches covered nearly every page. Ancient symbols, careful pronunciation marks, notes written in blue and black ink that had faded at different speeds over many years. Professor Emily Carter instinctively stepped closer. She recognized the discipline immediately. Whoever had created the notebook had not copied symbols for decoration. Every stroke reflected years of patient observation. Tiny arrows connected grammar patterns. Margin notes compared sentence structures across different fragments. There were corrections written over corrections, evidence of someone who had questioned every conclusion before writing another line. Whitmore accepted the notebook with both hands, almost unconsciously matching the respect Elias had shown. His eyes moved slowly across the first page, then the second, then the third. The confidence that had defined him throughout the afternoon gradually gave way to something quieter, curiosity, genuine curiosity. He adjusted his glasses once, then again, as though clearer lenses might somehow explain what he was reading. Collins finally broke the silence. "Anyone can fill a notebook with copied symbols," he said. "That proves nothing." Whitmore did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned another page and paused. Folded carefully between two sheets rested an aging newspaper clipping dated nearly 27 years earlier. The headline announced an archaeological symposium in Chicago. A list of keynote speakers appeared beneath it. Whitmore's own name stood near the top. Near the bottom, printed in much smaller letters, appeared another name, Samuel Brooks. Whitmore felt his breathing slow. A faint memory surfaced from decades earlier. A quiet man standing near the back of a crowded lecture hall. A man who had waited patiently after everyone else had left, hoping for only a few minutes to discuss an unfamiliar translation. Whitmore remembered apologizing because another meeting had already begun. He had accepted a sealed envelope from the stranger, thanked him politely, then handed the growing stack of unsolicited submissions to an assistant before catching a flight the following morning. He had never thought about the envelope again. His fingers tightened gently around the notebook. Across the page, written in careful handwriting, was a single sentence beneath one of the ancient passages. "One day someone will listen long enough to hear what these words are really saying." Whitmore swallowed quietly. The sentence did not sound like academic ambition. It sounded like hope preserved inside paper. He slowly lifted his eyes toward Elias. The boy remained exactly where he had been, shoulders relaxed beneath his faded hoodie, saying nothing, asking for nothing. He simply waited. Outside, the rain had finally begun to fade, and a narrow beam of evening sunlight slipped through the museum's towering windows, settling across the old notebook and the ancient stone at the same moment, as though two forgotten stories had finally found each other after waiting an entire generation. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore carefully closed the notebook without taking his eyes off the worn leather cover. The gallery remained so quiet that the distant ticking of the museum's century-old clock echoed through the marble hall. No one reached for a microphone. No one whispered another theory. For the first time that afternoon, the artifact beneath the protective glass was no longer the only mystery in the room. Whitmore slowly placed Samuel Brooks's notebook beside the ancient stone and compared the two with patient precision. Several pages contained symbols that did not exist in any published reference guide, yet they matched tiny markings carved into the document almost perfectly. Professor Emily Carter leaned closer until the reflection of the overhead lights shimmered across her glasses. "These pronunciation notes," she said quietly. "They explain sounds we assumed had been lost." Whitmore nodded almost absent-mindedly. "Not assumed," he corrected softly. "Accepted." The difference settled heavily over the scholars surrounding the display. Accepted meant generations of experts had stopped asking questions. Across the room, reporters lowered their voices. Even the flashing cameras became less frequent, as though everyone sensed they were witnessing something that deserved silence more than headlines. "Doctor," Richard Collins stepped forward with measured confidence, refusing to surrender his skepticism. "A notebook is still not proof that the translations are correct," he said. "Coincidences happen. Creative people fill notebooks every day." Elias looked toward him with the same calm expression he had carried since entering the museum. There was no resentment in his face, only patience. "You are right," he replied respectfully. "The notebook is not the proof." Collins folded his arms. "Then what is?" Elias turned toward the stone tablet resting beneath the glass. "The language answers its own questions if it is spoken the way it was written." Several puzzled expressions appeared throughout the audience. Whitmore glanced back toward the inscription. "Explain," he said. Elias took a slow breath. "My grandfather always told me these symbols were never meant to be read silently. The people who carved them believed meaning lived inside the sound. If one word changes, the next sentence changes with it." Emily exchanged a thoughtful look with Whitmore. Ancient oral traditions had followed similar patterns, but no surviving records had ever confirmed that this civilization used the same structure. Elias continued quietly. "You translated each symbol by itself. They expected them to be heard together." Whitmore's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the display case. He realized that every published translation over the past 40 years had approached the document exactly the same way, separating each symbol into isolated meanings instead of treating the inscription as a continuous spoken composition. The possibility sent an unexpected chill through him. Collins gave a restrained smile. "Interesting theory," he said. "Can you demonstrate it?" Elias nodded without hesitation. "Yes." The single word carried no pride, only quiet certainty. Whitmore slowly looked toward the museum director standing near the front row. The director hesitated before pressing a button that released the electronic lock protecting the climate-controlled display. A soft mechanical click echoed through the gallery. The glass enclosure lifted several inches with a gentle hum, allowing the cool, dry air surrounding the artifact to drift into the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Whitmore stepped aside and looked directly at Elias. It was the first time all afternoon that the world's leading authority on the forgotten language willingly surrendered the space beside the ancient document to a homeless boy wearing faded sneakers and a weathered gray hoodie. As Elias quietly approached the stone, the final rays of evening sunlight stretched across its weathered surface, illuminating symbols that had waited centuries for someone to speak them aloud. The ancient stone seemed almost ordinary until Elias Brooks stood before it. He did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes for a single quiet moment, drawing one slow breath as though listening for something beneath the silence that surrounded him. The museum lights reflected softly across the weathered surface, while the last traces of rain shimmered beyond the towering windows. Hundreds of people watched without moving. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore folded his hands behind his back. Professor Emily Carter unconsciously held her breath. Even Dr. Richard Collins, who had questioned every word Elias spoke, remained unusually still. Elias finally opened his eyes and rested his fingertips lightly against the edge of the display table rather than the artifact itself. My grandfather always said these words were never meant to be rushed, he said softly. They were spoken like someone greeting the morning, not delivering a speech. His voice carried no drama, only quiet respect. Whitmore nodded once. "Whenever you are ready," he replied. Elias looked across the carved symbols one line at a time. His lips moved silently at first, tracing patterns invisible to everyone else. Then, with remarkable calm, he began to speak. The language flowed through the gallery with gentle rhythm, each phrase rising and falling almost musically. No one understood the words, yet everyone sensed they belonged together. The harsh pauses found in previous academic reconstructions were gone. Instead, every sentence connected naturally to the next, like water moving through a winding stream. The sound filled the marble hall with unexpected warmth. Emily felt the hairs on her arms rise. She had heard recordings of reconstructed ancient languages from universities around the world, but none had carried this strange balance of precision and emotion. Whitmore quietly compared every spoken phrase with Samuel Brooks's notebook, following the pronunciation marks line by line. They matched with astonishing consistency. Collins tried to interrupt. He could simply be inventing the melody, he argued, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Elias did not stop reading. He neither hurried nor hesitated. Every symbol seemed to reveal the next before his eyes reached it. Television cameras continued recording, but the operators had forgotten to adjust their positions. Reporters lowered their notebooks. Somewhere near the rear of the gallery, an elderly museum volunteer slowly removed her glasses, overcome not by understanding, but by the unmistakable feeling that something forgotten had returned after an impossibly long absence. As Elias completed the final phrase, silence settled over the room once again. It was different from the silence before. Earlier it had been filled with doubt. Now it carried expectation. Whitmore carefully examined the final page of Samuel Brooks's notebook, where a complete translation had been written in neat handwriting beneath the pronunciation guide. His eyes moved from the notebook to the stone, then back again. The first translated sentence appeared exactly where Elias had paused. Whitmore swallowed quietly before reading the English translation aloud. To the stranger who arrives with an open heart, wisdom will always open its door first. Emily closed her eyes for a brief second. The sentence perfectly explained why the third symbol represented an open doorway instead of a mountain. The translation that scholars had defended for decades had been wrong from its very beginning. Collins stared at the stone without speaking. For the first time in many years, the room was no longer waiting for its most celebrated experts to explain history. It was waiting for a homeless black boy to continue telling it. No one applauded. The silence that followed carried far more weight than applause ever could. Every face in the gallery remained fixed on Elias Brooks, as though speaking too soon might somehow disturb the fragile bridge that had just formed between the present and a civilization long believed impossible to understand. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore carefully laid Samuel Brooks's notebook beside the ancient stone, aligning both with almost ceremonial precision. His fingertips lingered on the worn leather cover before he slowly looked toward Elias. "There is another passage," he said quietly, "one that none of us have been able to interpret because the symbols appear nowhere else." Elias nodded almost immediately. "They are not separate words," he answered. "They are directions for the reader." Several scholars exchanged puzzled looks. Professor Emily Carter leaned closer to the lower edge of the tablet, where a narrow column of unfamiliar markings curved toward one corner. "Directions?" she asked. Elias stepped beside the display, careful never to touch the stone itself. "The inscription is meant to be read while walking," he explained. "My grandfather called it a traveling prayer. The reader would begin facing the sunrise, then slowly turn as each section was spoken." Collins frowned. "That makes no academic sense." Elias met his eyes politely. "It does if the writing was part of a ceremony instead of a speech." Whitmore's expression changed again. He quickly opened the excavation report and searched through photographs taken before the artifact had been moved into the museum. One image showed the stone exactly where archaeologists had uncovered it. Emily suddenly noticed something everyone else had overlooked. "The base," she whispered. It was aligned almost perfectly with east. Whitmore measured the excavation notes with his finger. 89 degrees from true east. Nearly exact. His heartbeat quickened. Every translation attempt over the previous months had assumed the stone could be read from any position, yet the original excavation team had unknowingly documented its intended orientation. Elias quietly continued. If someone stands in the wrong place, the prayer loses its rhythm. Some words change meaning because they describe movement, not objects. Whitmore slowly circled the display until he stood where the artifact had originally faced according to the field report. He glanced toward Elias. "Show us." The boy stepped back, giving the distinguished scholar the position of honor. "Please begin where the sun would rise," he said gently. Whitmore inhaled deeply before repeating the first phrases exactly as Elias had spoken them. This time he slowly turned with each section, following the path Elias described. Something remarkable happened. The repeated symbols that had puzzled linguists for decades suddenly formed a consistent grammatical pattern. Emily's eyes widened as she scribbled notes across her legal pad. The structure was no longer fragmented. It flowed with elegant logic. Even Collins silently reread the projected inscription, searching for an error that refused to appear. The museum director glanced toward the rows of journalists. None of them were typing anymore. They simply watched history quietly rewrite itself a few feet in front of them. Whitmore completed the final line and lowered his voice almost to a whisper. "We were not translating a document," he said. "We were standing in the wrong place the entire time." Elias offered a small, grateful smile. "My grandfather used to say knowledge is not only about seeing the words. Sometimes it begins with standing where the people who wrote them once stood." Whitmore looked at the teenager for a long moment, and in that instant he realized the greatest discovery of the day was not the stone resting beneath the museum lights. It was the quiet boy who had carried its forgotten voice into the room without asking for recognition, only hoping someone would finally be willing to listen. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore remained motionless beside the ancient stone, his eyes fixed not on the inscription but on Elias Brooks. The applause that usually followed groundbreaking academic discoveries never came. Instead, a deep, thoughtful silence settled over the gallery, like the final moments after a church bell faded into the distance. Professor Emily Carter carefully gathered the excavation photographs spread across the presentation table. One image caught her attention immediately. It showed the underside of the artifact before conservation work had begun. "Jonathan," she said quietly, sliding the photograph toward him. "Look at the lower edge." Whitmore leaned closer. Beneath layers of dirt revealed in the original excavation image was a narrow row of markings that had disappeared after centuries of erosion. They were almost invisible in person but surprisingly clear in the untouched field photograph. Elias recognized them instantly. "That is not decoration," he said. "It tells the reader when to stop speaking." Emily looked at him with growing curiosity. "How can you know that from only a few marks?" Elias smiled faintly. "Because they are not letters. They are breathing marks." Several linguists exchanged confused glances. Whitmore slowly lifted Samuel Brooks's notebook once again. After turning several pages, he found a hand-drawn diagram showing identical symbols accompanied by a simple handwritten note. "Pause until the silence becomes part of the sentence." Whitmore quietly repeated the line to himself. It sounded less like a technical instruction and more like wisdom passed from one generation to another. Dr. Richard Collins stepped toward the projection screen, searching for another explanation. "Even if these marks control rhythm," he argued, "that does not prove the translation itself is accurate." Elias nodded respectfully. "You are right," he answered. "There is one more piece." Without hesitation, he pointed toward the center of the stone, where a cluster of symbols surrounded a circular carving no larger than a silver dollar. "Everyone has translated that circle as the sun," he said. "My grandfather said it was never the sun." Whitmore narrowed his eyes. "Then what is it?" Elias looked toward the skylight high above the museum's ceiling where the clouds had finally begun to separate. Thin rays of evening light slipped through the glass, spreading softly across the gallery floor. "It is an empty place," Elias said. "The reader was never supposed to speak that symbol. The light was supposed to finish the sentence." The room became perfectly still. Emily slowly checked the archaeological survey again. According to the excavation records, the stone had originally stood beneath an opening carved into the roof of an ancient ceremonial chamber. During certain hours of the day, Sunlight would have fallen directly onto the circular carving. Whitmore's pulse quickened. The builders designed the monument so nature completed the message, he whispered. Emily looked from the photograph to the stone, then toward the fading sunlight streaming through the museum skylight. The angle was nearly identical. As the beam touched the circular carving, the surrounding symbols reflected faintly against the polished glass beneath the display, revealing a pattern no digital scan had ever captured. Several people gasped softly. Collins stared without speaking. The projection software had missed it because the reflection only appeared under natural light. Whitmore slowly removed his glasses and closed them in one hand. After decades spent searching excavation sites and forgotten it had been waiting for someone who understood that knowledge could live inside silence, light, and patience just as much as words themselves. As the golden beam rested across the stone, Whitmore realized he was no longer leading the discovery. He was learning from a quiet homeless boy whose greatest inheritance had never been money or status, but a grandfather who refused to let forgotten wisdom disappear. The golden light lingered across the ancient stone for only a few minutes before the sun drifted lower behind the city skyline, but the impression it left inside the gallery refused to fade. No one hurried toward the exits. No one checked a watch. It felt as though time itself had quietly agreed to wait. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore carefully compared the newly revealed reflection with the sketches inside Samuel Brooks's notebook, tracing each line with the tip of a pencil instead of touching the fragile paper. Every angle matched, every missing pause, every silent space. Professor Emily Carter looked toward Elias Brooks with growing admiration. "Your grandfather understood something we completely overlooked," she said. Elias lowered his eyes for a moment. He always believed the people who carved this wanted future generations to slow down before trying to understand them. Whitmore closed the notebook gently. "How long did he study this language?" Elias answered after a thoughtful pause. "Almost 40 years. Several people in the audience quietly exchanged surprised glances. 40 years? Emily repeated. Elias nodded. He worked nights at a freight warehouse. During the day, he studied photographs from libraries because he could not afford to travel to the excavation sites. Every paycheck bought another used book, instead of something for himself. Whitmore felt an uncomfortable weight settle in his chest. He had spent his career surrounded by grants, university archives, research assistants, and international conferences. Somewhere, not very far away, another scholar had built an extraordinary body of knowledge from second-hand books and handwritten notes without receiving recognition from a single institution. Dr. Richard Collins remained unusually quiet until one reporter finally asked the question everyone else had been avoiding. If Samuel Brooks knew so much, why did history never remember him? Elias looked toward the notebook resting beside the stone. A faint smile crossed his face, filled more with gratitude than sadness. He told me history does not choose who is right. People do. The sentence lingered in the stillness. Collins looked away. Whitmore slowly removed the old newspaper clipping from between the notebook pages once more. On the reverse side was a folded letter, yellowed with age and carefully preserved. He unfolded it with deliberate care. The first line immediately caught his attention. It was addressed to him. Dear Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, I believe our research has been walking beside each other for many years, even though we have never truly met. Whitmore stopped reading aloud. His fingers trembled almost imperceptibly. The date at the top matched the symposium he barely remembered attending decades earlier. Emily watched his expression change as he continued silently through the letter. The room remained completely still. After several long moments, Whitmore finally lifted his eyes toward Elias. Your grandfather wrote this for me, he said quietly. Elias nodded. He hoped you would read it one day. Whitmore glanced back at the final page where Samuel Brooks had signed his name beneath one simple sentence. If someone ever finishes this translation, please remember that wisdom belongs to everyone willing to listen, not only to those invited into the room. Whitmore closed his eyes briefly before folding the letter with extraordinary care. He realized that the greatest twist of the afternoon was no longer the ancient language itself. It was the painful truth that the answer had existed for decades, patiently waiting inside a letter that one respected scholar had never taken the time to open. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore held the fragile letter with both hands as though it weighed far more than a single sheet of paper. The edges had yellowed with age, yet the ink remained remarkably clear, every sentence written with patient precision. He continued reading silently while the museum waited with unusual restraint. Professor Emily Carter noticed his shoulders slowly sink, not from exhaustion but from the unmistakable burden of realization. Finally, Whitmore looked up. His voice, once steady with academic certainty, now carried quiet humility. "Samuel Brooks did not ask for recognition," he said. "He asked for collaboration." He carefully turned the letter toward Emily. Near the bottom of the page, another folded sheet rested beneath it. Emily gently unfolded the second document and immediately noticed a detailed illustration of the ancient tablet. Every symbol had been carefully copied by hand, decades before the recent excavation had even taken place. Beside several carvings, Samuel had drawn tiny directional arrows and brief notes describing how natural light interacted with specific markings during different seasons of the year. Emily compared the drawing with the museum's three-dimensional digital scan displayed on the enormous screen behind them. Her eyes widened. "Jonathan," she whispered, "look at the lower right corner." Whitmore followed her finger. One faint symbol appeared on Samuel's drawing but seemed missing from the museum model. The conservation team quickly enlarged the highest resolution excavation photographs. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Then one technician adjusted the image contrast. A nearly invisible fracture crossed the surface of the stone, exactly where Samuel had drawn the missing mark. The carving had not disappeared. Centuries of erosion had simply hidden it beneath a thin layer of mineral deposits. The room filled with quiet astonishment. Samuel Brooks had recorded a symbol that modern technology had almost overlooked. Dr. Richard Collins stepped closer to the screen, studying the comparison in silence. For the first time all afternoon, he found no flaw to challenge. Whitmore slowly smiled, though sadness lingered behind his eyes. "He was right," he said almost to himself. "He saw what we could not." Elias Brooks remained standing near the display, with the same calm expression he had carried since entering the museum. He did not celebrate. He simply watched his grandfather's work finally receive the attention it had deserved years earlier. Emily turned another page from Samuel's notebook and discovered a small envelope tucked inside the back cover. Written across the front in neat handwriting were only 6 words: "Open only after the language lives again." Whitmore looked toward Elias before carefully opening it. Inside rested a single photograph. It showed a much younger Samuel Brooks sitting at a modest kitchen table beside a smiling little boy whose feet barely reached the floor. Ancient books surrounded them instead of toys. Between them lay sheets of paper covered with the same mysterious symbols now filling the museum screens. Whitmore quietly handed the photograph to Elias. A gentle smile crossed the teenager's face. "I was 8, he said softly. "Every Saturday morning we studied together until the library closed." Whitmore nodded, understanding far more than the words themselves. Samuel had never trained his grandson to impress universities or win awards. He had simply passed knowledge from one generation to the next, because he believed truth deserved to survive. As evening shadows slowly stretched across the marble floor, Whitmore looked around the gallery filled with scholars, journalists, students, and museum visitors before speaking the words he never imagined he would one day say. "Today we did not rescue a forgotten language," he said quietly. "A forgotten family rescued it for all of us." The words settled over the gallery with remarkable gentleness, yet they carried the unmistakable weight of truth. No one rushed to ask another question. No one hurried toward the cameras waiting outside. "Doctor," Jonathan Whitmore slowly walked to the podium, where he had confidently declared only an hour earlier that the language had no surviving speakers and no complete interpretation. The prepared notes for his presentation still rested there, neatly stacked beside a glass of untouched water. He looked at the pages for a long moment before quietly closing the folder without reading another line. "I owe everyone in this room an apology," he said. His voice echoed softly beneath the vaulted ceiling, free from pride and free from excuses. "Not because our research was incomplete. Every discovery begins incomplete. I owe an apology because I stopped believing that wisdom could come from places I was not expecting." His eyes found Elias Brooks standing quietly beside the ancient stone. The teenager had never stepped into the spotlight. He remained near the display where his grandfather's notebook rested, almost as though protecting it one final time. Whitmore continued. Many years ago, a man named Samuel Brooks trusted that I would read his work. I accepted his letter. I never truly received it because I never opened it. The admission lingered in the air. Reporters slowly lowered their microphones. The honesty itself had become the story. Professor Emily Carter looked toward Elias with quiet admiration. "Your grandfather never stopped teaching," she said softly. Elias smiled. "He used to tell me that being ignored is painful, but letting bitterness replace kindness is even worse. He said knowledge grows only when it is shared." Whitmore nodded, feeling every word. Dr. Richard Collins remained near the projection screen, unusually silent. After several long moments, he stepped forward until he stood only a few feet from Elias. The confidence that had colored every criticism throughout the afternoon had disappeared. "I judged you before hearing you," he said quietly. "I saw your clothes before I listened to your words." Elias met his eyes without resentment. "A lot of people do," he answered gently. "It is easier to notice what someone is carrying than what someone has learned." Collins lowered his head. There was no argument left to make. Emily carefully closed Samuel Brooks's notebook and placed it inside the faded cloth Elias had brought with him. "This belongs in the museum archives," she said. Elias slowly shook his head. "It belongs wherever people will actually read it." The sentence caught Whitmore by surprise. Samuel Brooks had spent decades hoping someone would open his work, and now his grandson cared less about where it was stored than whether it would inspire another curious mind. Whitmore looked toward the museum director. "Tomorrow morning I will recommend that Samuel Brooks be formally recognized as a contributing scholar to this discovery. Every future publication will acknowledge his work and the role Elias played today." The director nodded without hesitation. Several members of the audience quietly applauded, not with excitement but with gratitude. The sound spread gently across the hall until nearly everyone joined. Elias looked down, slightly embarrassed by the attention. He had not come searching for applause. He had come because his grandfather believed forgotten voices deserved another chance to be heard. As the applause slowly faded, Whitmore extended his hand toward Elias. The boy accepted it with a warm, respectful smile. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. In that quiet handshake, one generation finally honored another, and a lesson far greater than any translation had already begun to rewrite every heart in the room. The museum remained open long after its scheduled closing time, yet not a single visitor seemed eager to leave. Outside, the sidewalk still glistened from the afternoon rain, while the skyline reflected across the tall glass walls in shades of amber and deep blue. Inside, staff members quietly replaced the bright presentation lights with softer evening illumination, allowing the ancient stone and Samuel Brooks's notebook to rest beneath a warmer glow. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore stood beside the museum director reviewing a freshly drafted statement that would be released to universities, research institutes, and historical societies across the country before sunrise. Every future publication concerning the discovery would now include Samuel Brooks as a contributing scholar whose preserved research had transformed the understanding of the language. Professor Emily Carter carefully scanned every sentence before placing her signature beneath Whitmore's. She smiled gently as she handed the document to Elias Brooks. "Would you like to read it first?" she asked. Elias accepted the pages with both hands. His eyes moved slowly across each line. He was not searching for his own name. Instead, he quietly stopped when he reached his grandfather's. His fingertips rested lightly against the printed letters for several seconds before he looked up with a grateful smile that needed no explanation. "He would have liked this," Elias said softly. Whitmore nodded. "He earned it many years ago. We are simply late." The museum director then reached into a leather folder and removed another document. "There is one more decision," she said. "Beginning next month, the gallery housing this artifact will include a permanent exhibit telling the complete story of how the language was finally understood. Samuel Brooks's research will be displayed with his family's permission, and your grandfather's notebook will be digitally preserved, so students everywhere can study it." Elias looked at the familiar notebook resting inside its faded cloth. "He always wanted people to learn," he replied. "If sharing it helps someone stay curious, then he would have said yes." Emily felt her eyes grow warm. She had spent years teaching archaeology, encouraging students to challenge assumptions and ask difficult questions. Yet no lecture she had ever given carried the quiet strength contained inside that simple answer. Nearby, several graduate students who had attended the presentation remained gathered around the ancient stone, speaking softly among themselves. One young researcher finally approached Elias with a notebook in her hands. "Would you mind showing me how you knew where to pause while reading?" she asked. Elias smiled and gently demonstrated the breathing marks his grandfather had taught him to recognize as a child. Soon, another student joined them, then another, until a small circle quietly formed around the teenager who only hours earlier had entered the museum unnoticed. Whitmore watched from across the gallery. No one cared about titles anymore. No one asked who held the highest academic rank. They simply listened. The evening light continued fading beyond the windows as the museum settled into peaceful silence once again. The ancient language was no longer disappearing into history. It was being passed from one curious mind to another, exactly as Samuel Brooks had always hoped. Standing a short distance away, Whitmore quietly folded the original letter and placed it back inside the notebook before whispering words meant only for himself. "Thank you for believing someone would eventually open it." Elias looked toward the old notebook one last time before gently wrapping it in its worn cloth again, knowing that his grandfather's greatest legacy had never been the pages themselves, but the hearts that were finally ready to read them. The following morning, the first rays of sunlight slipped across the museum steps long before the doors opened to the public. Fresh newspapers rested inside metal racks along the sidewalk, each carrying the same photograph across the front page. It was not a picture of the ancient stone. It was not a picture of Dr. Jonathan Whitmore standing behind a podium. It was a simple image of Elias Brooks holding his grandfather's worn notebook with both hands, while a beam of evening light rested across its faded cover. Visitors began gathering outside hours before opening time. Some came because they loved history. Others came because they had heard that a forgotten scholar had finally been remembered. Inside the gallery, a new bronze plaque had already been placed beside the display case. Beneath the description of the artifact appeared a second inscription: Samuel Brooks, independent researcher. His preserved work transformed the modern understanding of this ancient language. Beneath those words, in smaller letters, another sentence had been added: rediscovered through the courage and knowledge of his grandson, Elias Brooks. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore stood quietly reading the plaque before the first guests entered. He smiled to himself, not because history had changed overnight, but because honesty finally had. Professor Emily Carter walked into the gallery, carrying a small cardboard box. Inside were carefully restored copies of Samuel's handwritten notes, prepared for students who wished to continue studying the language. She placed the first copy onto a reading table near the exhibit and looked toward Whitmore. "He is already teaching people," she said softly. Whitmore nodded, just as he always intended. A few minutes later, the front doors opened. Families, students, teachers, and researchers slowly filled the hall. Many paused before the notebook longer than they did before the stone itself. Parents quietly pointed toward Samuel's name while children asked who he was. Museum volunteers smiled as they shared the story, not of fame or fortune, but of patience, kindness, and a lifetime of quiet dedication. Elias arrived without cameras following him. He wore the same faded hoodie and carried the same backpack over one shoulder. Nothing about him suggested the attention now surrounding his name. He entered the gallery, smiled politely at the staff, and stood for a moment before the exhibit. He gently rested one hand against the strap of his backpack and looked at his grandfather's notebook resting safely beneath the glass. "We made it," he whispered almost too quietly to hear. Whitmore stepped beside him but said nothing. Some moments were too meaningful for speeches. Together, they watched strangers stop, read Samuel Brooks's name, and move on carrying a little more curiosity than they had brought with them. Outside, the city awakened with the familiar sounds of buses, footsteps, and distant traffic, while inside the museum, another kind of journey quietly began. Students opened notebooks. Researchers asked new questions. Children stared at ancient symbols with wide eyes, instead of assuming they were impossible to understand. Elias turned toward the exit as morning sunlight poured through the towering windows, wrapping the marble floor in warm gold. He still owned no house. He still carried everything he had inside one weathered backpack. Yet the world no longer saw only a homeless black boy. It saw the keeper of a forgotten voice, the grandson of a man history had almost overlooked, and living proof that wisdom has never cared about status, wealth, or appearance. It has always waited patiently for someone willing to listen first.